Thank you, Mr. President. Let me say at the outset that I'd like to set the record straight on the question of the FBI interview, which has been raised repeatedly by members on the other side of the aisle. It was our request from the start, when we heard the complaints of Dr. Ford, her allegations, that there be a thorough FBI investigation. On the Democratic side, we asked for that repeatedly from the Republican majority. It wasn't until Senator Flake and some of his Republican colleagues made a point of saying they wouldn't move to go forward with this hearing without an FBI investigation that it finally was agreed to. Let me also add that statements have been made publicly by the public spokesman at the White House about how the witnesses were chosen for this FBI investigation. According to Mr. Shah, who works in the White House, he told us that a list of witnesses was sent by Senate Republicans to the White House, and they were included in their request. That is not the investigation we were looking for. We were hoping the FBI would revert to its professional status and to interview all of the witnesses who are relevant. Certainly among those relevant witnesses would have been Dr. Ford herself, who could have been questioned under penalty of criminal prosecution if she misled or lied to the FBI, who could have provided substantial corroborative information. She was never called on. Neither was Judge Kavanaugh by the FBI. Dr. Ford provided 8 different witnesses that she thought should be called to back up her side of the story. Not a single one of them was called by the FBI. Ms. Ramirez suggested 20 witnesses be called by the FBI on her behalf. Not one of them was called. This was not the FBI investigation which we sought, nor does it clear the charges against Judge Kavanaugh that were raised by Dr. Ford based on the fact that it was a scant interview that involved some 10 witnesses in a matter of just a few days with a limited roster of people who were going to be questioned. Let me speak to the matter at hand in a larger context. I've been in public life for a few years, but I've never seen the public reaction to this particular nomination and the hearings leading up to it that I've seen in this case. I went back to Illinois last week on Friday. Before I could get off the airplane at Midway Airport, people were talking to me, just passengers at random, about what had happened the day before when Dr. Ford and Judge Kavanaugh testified before our committee. The same thing happened with cab drivers, the doorman at the hotel holding an umbrella in the rain and talking to me about the testimony that was given to the Judiciary Committee. For the next 3 days, everywhere I turned, every person had a comment to make. America was tuned in and watching carefully because they knew how important this hearing was. It wasn't just the nomination for someone to serve on the Supreme Court. It was critically important to Americans to know who would be that person, what their views were when it came to the health of women, the protection of our health insurance, our privacy, our right to vote. And it also was very clear that we held this hearing in the context of a national debate on sexual harassment and sexual violence. Is it any surprise that this explosive issue, which has touched corporate boardrooms, our churches, sports, Congress, has now been raised in our debate over a nomination to our highest court? And I ask my colleagues, is there a single one of us in the last 2 weeks who has not had an experience with someone coming forward, either in writing or in person, to tell you of their experience when it came to sexual harassment and sexual violence? Just a few minutes ago, I read the latest letters we've received in our office, 2 women from my state of Illinois who told me in their letters they were saying for the first time what actually had happened to them many, many years ago and how much they identified with Dr. Ford and what she had gone through. That is a fact of life. The fact that this touched a nerve to so many Americans, and particularly to women who have gone through this experience, should put this whole debate in context. It should not be cheapened or lessened by political charges. We ought to understand the gravity of this debate in light of the cultural change we are now facing in America. This afternoon, we've reached the day of reckoning. Those of us who count votes for a living know how this will end. But I want to make it clear there's something we need to remember. One of the closest votes in the history of the Supreme Court will occur this afternoon with Judge Kavanaugh's nomination. You have to go back 137 years in American history to find a closer vote for a Supreme Court justice. That tells you the seriousness with which this matter has been considered and undertaken by members of the Senate and how divided we are on this nomination. But I want to ask my colleagues not just to reflect on this afternoon, but to reflect on tomorrow. What about the future of this Supreme Court, this important, critical institution in our Constitution? 6 years ago, in the days before the NFIB versus Sebelius decision, deciding the fate of the Affordable Care Act, a Pew Research poll found that public approval of the Supreme Court had reached an all-time low. Citizens United and Bush versus Gore had branded the Supreme Court as a political tool in the eyes of most Americans. Chief Justice Roberts stepped in and wrote a decision in that case which infuriated conservatives, but brought momentary credibility to the court. Filling this critical Kennedy vacancy with Judge Kavanaugh will again raise the question about Supreme Court politics. Chief Justice Roberts, are you watching? And what can we expect from this newest member of the court, Brett Kavanaugh? After his contentious nomination process, Clarence Thomas gave us 10 years of brooding silence on the bench of the Supreme Court. What can we expect from this new justice? Will he be the soup kitchen volunteer or the Federalist Society favorite? Will he be the man who raged at the Clintons and promised revenge for his ordeal, or the judge who impressed Senator Collins as more moderate than most of us on this side of the aisle ever found him? Will he be a justice forever grateful to President Trump who nominated him, or a justice who honors the rule of law more than any political leader or political party? And what about this Senate? What should the next Supreme Court vacancy look like? Will we continue to follow the Merrick Garland, plow it through playbook of judicial appointments at any cost, freezing out a nominee to the Supreme Court for almost 1 year, abandoning the blue slip process in the Senate Judiciary Committee, ignoring American Bar Association ratings, overturning rules protecting debate, concealing documents, tweeting confidential reports? When we sweep aside all the rules and traditions of the Senate Judiciary Committee just to pile up more and more Republican appointments to the court, what is left? Thomas More, in A Man for All Seasons, said famously, quote, "And when the last law was down and the devil turned round on you, where would you hide, the laws all being flat? And if you cut them down, do you really think you would stand upright in the winds that would blow then?" So will we establish and reestablish rules and procedures that show mutual respect for one another as senators and respect for this body we are honored to serve? I sincerely hope that conversation begins and begins soon. I want to say a word about the leaders of the Judiciary Committee. Chuck Grassley is my friend. He's been my friend for a long time. We do a lot of legislation together. We have a difference in political views. He's a loyal Republican. I'm a loyal Democrat. We have adjoining states, and we find some things that we can work on in common. I want to say personally to him, thank you for your leadership on this committee. I think there are moments when the White House and even your staff got the best of you, but I trust you, Chuck Grassley, in terms of where this committee's going. You have it within your power to restore the traditions of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I hope that you will. I'll join you in that effort. I want to say a word about Dianne Feinstein, too. She's been the subject of more attacks by my colleagues than I've ever heard any member face in the Senate. It's just not fair. Dianne Feinstein is a woman of integrity. She is a person who is caring, and she has given a major part of her life in public service at so many different levels. Some of the charges and innuendo, which I've heard on the floor of the Senate, are unbefitting this body, and she does not deserve them. I thank Senator Collins yesterday for specifically saying that in her remarks. I couldn't be more happy than to join her in those comments. And I want to say a word about protesting and mob rule. I will tell you that if you believe in freedom of speech and our right as a citizen to petition our government, then you accept some tough consequences. There are things that are said and done in the name of free speech which you may not agree with. Violence is never acceptable. Let me make that clear. But the decision that's about to be made in the United States is not being made by a mob. It is not mob rule. It is a decision made by men and women of the United States Senate who are acting in accordance with the United States Constitution. And one last point on the subject. This is one that I always remind my colleagues and even my opponents of. I believe the hottest ring in hell is reserved for those who attack our children and our families. If you want to take me out on an issue, so be it. Leave my family and my kids alone. That ought to be a rule on both sides of the aisle. There's another issue which we need to face squarely. Will victims of sexual violence be more or less likely to step forward and tell their stories after this high-profile political battle ends? To Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, to her husband and her children, I'll never forget your brave testimony last Thursday. You gave new meaning to the term civic duty. You spoke not just for yourself, but for millions of sexual violence victims who will never, ever have that opportunity. I'm sorry, genuinely sorry, for the pain that you and your family have endured. And I'm sorry you were mocked by President Trump at his rally in Mississippi last Tuesday. The Washington Post reported, and I quote, "The president laid into Ford with the ruthlessness of an attack dog and the pacing of a stand-up comedian. The crowd roared with laughter and applause," end of quote. No one could have been surprised with the president's performance. And when I hear repeated over and over again on the other side of the aisle, we wanted to treat her just like we'd have our wife or daughter to be treated, that certainly didn't happen when it came to the president's comments. We owe it to our wives, daughters, granddaughters, and all the women and men in this country who have been victimized to treat them with respect, not ridicule. We owe it to these victims to listen, learn, and stand with them as they relive their shattering experiences. I believe the debate over this nomination has created a stronger force in our nation for justice for victims of sexual violence, and I hope those who step forward know that they are not alone. Thank you for your courage. Tomorrow is another day. We are blessed to live in a democracy which protects our freedoms and gives our citizens the last word at the polling place. Today, I will cast my vote in the Senate in opposition to the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court.